All right, final video for chapter 3. Sorry, this was a bit of a long one, 75 slides, so we're almost done though. So we're on number 59. We're talking about 802.11 Wi-Fi. So we've talked now about a few different network technologies. We've talked about Ethernet. We've talked about token ring. Actually, I think we talked about token ring last. So we've talked about Ethernet so far. Now let's talk about the extension to Ethernet known as Wi-Fi, otherwise referred to as wireless fidelity or 802.11. Okay, so the 802 or Project 802 we'll talk about in a little bit of detail in Chapter 7, and we'll discuss the standards in more detail. But 802 is sort of for labeling network technologies. There's a 802 dot, and then the number would signify the network technology, and then you add letters to signify different variations of that technology. So Ethernet would be 802.3, and to signify I don't remember what all the different lettering for Ethernet are, but to signify like 100 base TX would be 802.3U, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So you would add a letter after the 802.3 for Ethernet, U for 100 base TX. So something to that effect. That's how Project 802 works. We're not going to delve into that in too much detail right now, but 802.11 is the Project 802 IEEE standard for wireless networking, otherwise known as Wi-Fi. Wireless fidelity is what that stands for. So some terminology related to a Wi-Fi network is when you find a public Wi-Fi network that's available. This is known as a hotspot. So there's plenty of public networks available. You would find hotspots in places like Starbucks, McDonald's, Walmart now is doing it. Pretty much any business you can go to anymore is going to have a Wi-Fi hotspot available that's public. So anybody can access it. There's no authentication to access the network, and it's free for use. So that would be a hotspot. 802.11 or Wi-Fi is really just an extension to the Ethernet standard, so it's an extension to 802.3. The frames work the same way, so they still have MAC addresses that are characterized in the same exact way as Ethernet MAC addresses, and they still use the same type of frame. Maximum frame size, minimum frame size would all be the same. So in that way, the technology is very similar to Ethernet, but rather than using cabling as the medium, it's using the airwaves, and so that's where the 802.11 comes in. So it's a different technology as far as the medium is concerned, but as far as the underlying functionality of how frames are sent, it's the same. So, oops, let's go ahead and click next here. All right. So Wi-Fi can operate in one of two modes: infrastructure, which is the one we focus on for the most part, and a mode called ad hoc. Ad hoc is most often used in wireless printers, but it's a mode that allows a direct connection from one device to another device, and then that would send just data between those two devices. It'd be like saying, yes, I have a network printer, and you plug a Ethernet patch cable from the network port on your printer to your PC. Yes, you could technically print through that, and it would be a network printer, but it would be a point-to-point connection that just goes from your device to the printer, right? So in the same way, you can have an ad hoc network where it's a point-to-point connection between my PC and a device that would be my end device. So usually the end device is broadcasting a network name known as an SSID in a similar way that an access point would, which we'll look at in a minute. But that's where you would see your device. You would connect to it just in the same way that you connect to a wireless access point. And actually, I think we talked about SSID in the last chapter. So you guys know what that is, right? It's the network name associated to your wireless network. So when you do ad hoc setups on like a printer or peer-to-peer network where you're connecting from a PC to a printer or something to that effect. That would be using an SSID that's being broadcast by the printer. And then you would connect into that just in the same way you'd connect to any other network. So we don't really talk too much about that because it's kind of lame. It's not really used very often, though there are still printers out there that do use that functionality. And like I say, that's the most common place that you see it is in printing. There are other instances where you use ad hoc for different things. I think they consider it ad hoc. Well, actually, Bluetooth is a completely different 802 standard, so it's not even considered ad hoc when you connect a Bluetooth peer-to-peer network. So that would be called a personal area network, a PAN, and that's 802.15, I believe. So that's not even in the same category at this point, but it would be something similar to that. Okay. So Wi-Fi operates at two radio frequencies. They are 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz. The frequency is not fixed. There's variation in the frequency depending on a number of different factors. But the first variation is known as channels. And the channels for 2.4 gigahertz are 2.412 through 2.484. And that would be 14 channels 5 megahertz apart. So when you actually do the math, if you break it up, it'd be 2.412 would be channel 1, 2.417 would be channel 2, and so on until you get to the frequency 2.484, which is channel 14. Something to this effect right here. Okay, so each one goes up 5 megahertz. So just the last digit, and that would go up by 5. Now, actually, no, I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. So 2.412 through 2.484. Although I think that seems wrong. Anyways, 14 times. Okay, yeah, that's right. Okay, all right. I'm just confusing myself here. I apologize. Hopefully I'm not confusing you too much. Yes, it is 2.412 through 2.484, and they're 5 megahertz apart. So in North America, we only use channels 1 through 11. So in the US, we're part of North America. So channels 1 through 11 would be used. And now, that being said, channels, in order to operate functionally, in order to operate well, need to be 25 megahertz apart from any other frequencies. So usually, that means 5 channels away. So if you're using channel 1, that would mean that channel 6 is 5 channels away. So 1, 6, and 11 are the most common channels that are used because they're all 5 channels separated from the others, at least. Okay, 11 is actually 10 channels separated from 1, but it's 5 channels from 6, and 6 is 5 channels from 11. So let me give you a for instance of why you would need to do this. Let's suppose, there's a couple of instances where this might be necessary, but let's suppose you live in a neighborhood, and you've got neighbors, and here's your houses. So they've got an access point in here, you've got an access point in your front room, and your neighbors have an access point right there. So that's an up view of your houses, right? And here's your street, and your driveways coming off the street. Something looking sort of like that, right? Okay, these are your houses. That's the only point I want to make here. Okay, if your neighbor is on channel 1 over here, and your neighbor over here is on channel 6 right here. Okay, channel 6, channel 1, right? You would want to select channel 11. The reason being is that's going to not interfere on either of these two wireless access points. So if there's some overlap, let's say the range of their access point goes out from their device, right, and sort of overlaps with your house just a little bit, so you can actually see their wireless network in some of your rooms, right? Something like that, right? You see the range on these access points; those are represented by the dotted lines there. So there's some of their signal is actually bleeding into your house, And so that being said, you would want to make sure that you're not on the same channel as them, so as to avoid having problems with your connectivity. So that would create interference, radio frequency interference, that could prevent you from getting good connectivity all through your house. So using a different channel and five degrees of separation with that. The other instance where you might use that is, let's suppose perhaps that you're a network administrator and maybe you have a large warehouse, and let's say this is a very big warehouse, right? I don't even know. Let's just assume it's just massive. It's double the size of any Costco, all right? And you want to get good coverage, so you install access points all around in a pattern sort of like this, and the coverage comes out looking something like this. Oops. Okay. Okay, so these are the ranges. So this device has a range that goes out to here. This device right here has a range that comes around all the way around it. This device here comes out to here. This device here comes out to here. This device here comes out to here. That's sort of your range of wireless. Okay, you see that there's some overlap with these wireless access points. Okay, and so being the good network administrator that you are, you decide, hey, I don't want interference between my different access points, so I'm going to go ahead and set these to different channels rather than putting them into automatic channel selection mode. And so you say, I'm going to put the outside ones in 1, 6, and then this one's going to be 6 and 1. And you see the ones that are on channel 6, if you look here, this one right here is on channel 6, and then this one up here is also on channel 6. Okay, and then this one here is on channel 1, and this one down here is on channel 1. There's no overlap on those channels, right? There's no overlap between these access points because the range only goes so far. So now the last one you would put into channel 11 because that's not going to overlap with anything. Okay, so that's how you could develop a scheme, and so you could see how that would sort of pan out into a larger network scheme. Now a lot of devices, channel selection is going to be done automatically because many devices have a mode where you just put them into auto channel and they'll pick the channel by default on their own. That being said as well, some devices don't let you pick any other channels besides 1, 6, or 11. They won't let you even do it. So those are the only 3 options that you have. Even though technically you could use anything between 1 and 11, anything you wanted. So the channel works much like a TV channel. In order to access a network, you must be tuned to the correct channel to connect. So again, this is done automatically by most network interface cards. Your network interface card is going to pick the channel that your wireless access point is on and select it automatically. So it's going to see the 2.4 gigahertz frequency range, so everything from 2.412 to 2.484, and it's going to pick whichever channel is, what your device is actually broadcasting in. So, but you would set the channel on your access point, and usually your NIC would automatically select the channel that it needs to connect to that access point. All right. So a good way to handle this is when you're setting up any kind of wireless network, and this is just an aside, but using apps that you can download, like Wi-Fi analyzer apps. There's one that's really good for iPhone and Android. If I can pull it up here on my phone really quickly to sort of show you. It'll scan the frequencies in your area and tell you which frequencies are putting out the strongest outputs. And then you'll know, don't put my access point in there, in that frequency. Wi-Fi analyzer. I believe that's a frequency. Oh, hang on. Maybe I do. Maybe I don't have one. Spectrum. Sorry for the dead space here. Yeah, I guess I don't. unfortunately. So I thought I had one, but anyways, you can download apps for that, or you can download more advanced apps on like a laptop. Typically, if you're doing some kind of site survey where you're going to go figure out how you want to configure your wireless network, the best bet would be to use a more advanced site survey tool that you would have on like a laptop. So, and then take that around. I use a couple of different types of tools. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to show you what I have on my laptop for that. So the other frequency that's used and actually becoming more common is 5 gigahertz. So 2.4, if you want to know sort of the difference, 2.4, it's a shorter wavelength, and it moves more slowly through the air. 5 gigahertz is a longer wavelength, but it goes less distance. So 2.4, greater distance, slower speeds. Okay, so better range, greater distance, same thing. 5 gigahertz, lower range, but better speed. And that's, some people would argue that they've made improvements to 5 gigahertz, the 5 gigahertz sort of technology to make it better range, but I disagree. It's still very, very bad for any kind of physical barrier and long range. So physical barrier being like if you're outdoors and you have your wireless access point indoors, you hit a wall and it kills the signal. So 5 gigahertz tends to diffract a lot worse, and we'll look at the terms of what different things can happen with a wireless signal. But it tends to diffract off of things a lot worse, or rather reflect off of things a lot worse, not diffract. So that's sort of a problem. But there's 42 channels with 5 gigahertz. They're divided up kind of uniquely relative to 2.4 gigahertz. They're 10 megahertz, 20 megahertz, or 20 megahertz difference. And the point of this is spread spectrum wireless. It's kind of a unique wireless technology that makes it so that you can actually transmit multiple data streams at the same time. So 5 gigahertz is actually being developed now, where 2.4 has kind of reached its limit in terms of the max speeds that it can get. And the big problem with 2.4 gigahertz is that you have such a limited space to work with, and of course the channels are only 5 megahertz long, so you can't do much within that range as far as what's known as data streams. When you have 40 megahertz, you can divide that. If you divide 40 by 5, you can divide that into 5 data streams, and they will interfere with each other, but not like I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain. I think there's some videos on this topic that I can link to, but the 40 megahertz allows essentially dividing into sort of sub channels. It's still one channel when you're talking 5 gigahertz, but you can divide it into 8 sub channels and allow for 8 data streams at the same time. That basically allows simulcasting, meaning 8 streams can be happening at once. 8 streams of data can be happening at once, whereas with 2.4 you can only have 1 stream happening at once. And we'll look at that. The very next slide, or maybe the next slide after that, maybe not. Okay, so we'll look at that in a minute. But here you see a screenshot of a typical wireless router configuration window, and this just shows you the different channels that you can use. You see channel 1 here, and it's 2.412, and you can actually see what all the different channels are. This only goes up to, of course, channel 11, because this is in North America, and so it does not go all the way up to channel 14. So there you have it. This one will let you select any channel. Now, what I drew here, oops, there we go. What I drew here shows you the 3 main channels that you would use, but you could do a similar setup and use channels 2, channel 7 instead of channel 1 and 6 if you wanted to sort of separate it out, and then you would still use channel 11, but there could be some interference with channel 11. So the reason why you use 1, 6, and 11 is because they're each 5 megahertz away from each other, or I'm sorry, 25 megahertz away from each other, which is the minimum that you want to do when you're using 2.4 gigahertz frequency. Okay, so the antenna on a wireless device, whether that's an access point or a network interface card, is acting in two fashions: a transmitter and a receiver, or a sender and a receiver. The transmitter would be what transmits your wireless signal out. The receiver would be what receives a wireless signal in on the line. So characteristics and placement determine how well a device transmits and receives wireless signal. So what this is referring to is the characteristics of the actual antenna. How long is the antenna? Is it I wish I had one to show you, but I don't. Is it in some kind of metal tube to make it shoot in one direction, shoot the signal in one direction? Is it or focused in one direction? So there's certain characteristics, certain things that can change about an antenna to make it transmit in a different way, in a different fashion. And then the placement, how much interference is there around it? So are you putting it in an area that's very confined with a lot of physical barriers, because physical barriers can affect wireless signals? Is it in a place that's very with a lot of RFI? These different things could affect it. So placement, characteristics of the antenna. How long is the antenna? The length of the antenna. Sometimes a wavelength might not be able to be read by an antenna because of the fact that the antenna is placed or is too short. So sometimes too short of an antenna might not be able to read different signals, especially 5 gigahertz. So with 5 gigahertz wireless signal, you tend to have slightly longer antennas. With 2.4, you can get away with a relatively short antenna. With 5 gigahertz, you tend to have a slightly longer one. It's not about the wavelength, it's actually about the amplitude. It's the height of the waves, from the lowest point to the highest point, the crest to the peak, I think the terminology. I don't know about the exact terminology on that, I'm sorry, but it's about the amplitude. How big is the wave? And 5 gigahertz waves are a little bit larger, so you need a larger antenna, or a longer antenna rather. And then the 2.4 gigahertz frequency is about yay long, so you only need an antenna that's relatively short. Okay. So antennas are characterized by their radiation pattern. This would be how the signal is sent. So the orientation of the signal. And so there's sort of two official antenna types. Omnidirectional would mean that the signal is transmitted in all directions. Okay, so it's sent out as a sort of a bubble that expands out from the antenna. So if this is my antenna, this would be my signal expanding out. So when a wave is sent, imagine the signal just kind of grows out from there and expands out in all directions. Okay, and then eventually weakens to the point where it's no longer a viable signal. Okay, and with a unidirectional antenna, they actually are usually something to this effect. They kind of are funny. They look like a Pringles can, and then they have a little tripod or bipod or whatever, and then inside them they have a little antenna, and out of them a wire. So they look something like this. In my high school, I have one that I pull out, and all my students, they go, "What is that?" And I say, "It's a Wi-Fi laser gun." And actually, that's not totally inaccurate. And the reason why is because if anybody here in this class knows anything about the electromagnetic spectrum, light and radio waves or radio frequencies are on the same spectrum, right? The electromagnetic spectrum. And so visible light, what we see, or lasers, right? Lasers are just a focused beam of electromagnetic frequency. Some of that's visible. Sometimes we can actually see it. Sometimes it's invisible. And in the case of 2.4 gigahertz radio frequency or 5 gigahertz radio frequency, it's an invisible laser. But when you have a directional antenna, it focuses the signal. So everything bounces around, in and around, and eventually signal shoots out in one direction as a radio signal. And it's focused in that direction. So everything bounces around in here until eventually, and if you think about my squiggly lines, all my scribbles, as radio waves, sorry, hopefully this thing focuses good, as radio waves sort of bouncing around, jiggling around all through, they're hitting all sides and not really escaping, maybe some leakage, You might have the occasional leak of signal, but it doesn't go far, right? But ultimately, the majority of the radio signals, the RFI frequencies are going to be shot out in a single direction, much like a laser light shoots out all of the light. It focuses all of the light and shoots it out in one direction. So this can be done in the case of radio frequency with something as simple as a steel container that's spherical that eventually is going to focus everything, and everything's going to just sort of bounce around in there and eventually shoot out the front. So that would be a unidirectional antenna. And then there's another type of antenna, and this is one that's sort of questionable as far as how legit this is, but it's called a semi-directional antenna. And if you were to look at the signal, if I were to say right here, let's just say we're mounting this on a building, okay? Okay, and this is our access point, and we want it to be focused generally in this direction. We've got maybe a yard. Let's say it's a schoolyard, and you want to be able to have your students do homework on the schoolyard. This semi-directional antenna would shoot your signal in something of a relatively focused direction. Just say this direction you would receive the majority of the signal, and some would bleed out the back, but this is why it's called a semi-directional antenna. Okay, so it's kind of shooting it off into the direction of the yard. You do have some bleeding out the back. It's not as focused as a unidirectional antenna, but it's semi-directional, meaning it's sort of got a focused area that it's covering. And you want to think about it like that. It just says this area is being covered by this antenna. That's called a semi-directional antenna. Don't worry about that as far as curriculum is concerned. That's not included in any tests. You will be questioned about a unidirectional antenna. There is a question on the test that asks about a long, narrow ballroom. And as you can see from the slide, this is ideal for placement at the end of long, narrow spaces. Okay, so keep in mind that is a unidirectional antenna that would be used in a long, narrow space. Now, they're often used for wireless point-to-point bridges. I would say more often than used as antennas for focusing in a long, narrow area. It's more often, those are more often, like I say, used for wireless signal in a point-to-point bridge, a wireless bridge. So, okay, so the Wi-Fi access method. We've talked about media access method. The media access method for Ethernet is known as CSMA-CD. Carrier sense multiple access collision detection. But of course, you can't really detect a collision. So in Ethernet, of course, they can't hear if another station is transmitting unless they already hear it, right? So they can hear it if they already hear it, but if they transmit at the same moment, if there's nobody transmitting and two devices transmit at the same moment in Ethernet, then a collision will occur, and that's why they use collision detection. They detect a collision, they retransmit, right? Where Wi-Fi, rather than doing that, it can actually hear if a station begins to transmit, because wireless signals travel at the speed of light, or just under, maybe, I don't know, electricity is like 400 kilometers per second less, which when you're talking about the speed of light, it's pretty inconsequential. So I think it's something similar with radio frequency. Although it is electromagnetic spectrum, technically it's still photons. I don't know if it's at the speed of light, but I think it's very close. If it's not exactly the same speed as visible light, it is very close. So, anyway, that was a distraction. But so because wireless devices can hear a transmission occurring, they use what's known as collision avoidance. They listen, and if another device is sending, they don't send because they know that another device is sending. As soon as they hear quiet, they do what's known as a request to send. Everybody else hears the request on that same wireless frequency, hears that request, and so they don't transmit. Once the receiving device sends a clear to send acknowledgement, then they begin to transmit their actual data. So This can only happen by one device at a time on 2.4 gigahertz frequency because 5 gigahertz frequency has some better technology, particularly with newer versions of the 5 gigahertz frequency. It can actually transmit. Multiple devices can do this at the same time. So, but because of all the extra chatter, throughput, which is the actual speed of connection, is actually cut in half. So your bandwidth might be 100 megabits per second, or really in wireless frequencies, one of the more common speeds is 300 megabits per second. But your actual throughput, because of all the chatter, when you have multiple devices connected up to an infrastructure-based network, multiple devices connected up to a single access point, that produces extra chatter because everybody's saying, hey, request to send, clear to send, all this extra stuff. It's known as overhead on the network. So all this extra overhead on your network is causing a little bit of extra latency in the ability to send data. So the actual throughput, the amount of data being transmitted between a device and a wireless transmitter and a wireless receiver, is usually about cut in half. And then, of course, bandwidth sharing kicks in, and anytime you have a logical bus, which is how a wireless access point functions, it's more like a hub than a switch. It's a logical bus. You can only really have one device transmitting at the same time. So, okay. So I want to give some definitions for some common types of signal interference. Now, interference, I think, is maybe not the greatest term, but I guess maybe, yeah, it is. It is a good term for this. It's what can happen to a wireless signal in between transmitter and receiver that can affect it negatively, so that would kill the signal. So the first thing that can happen is absorption. Solid objects and even non-solid objects like fluid objects like the air eventually will absorb radio signals. So it's the same problem that you have with electricity on a copper wire. Eventually it's going to absorb some of the electrical impulse as it goes along. The process of that absorption is called attenuation. Attenuation, if you want to think about it in a nutshell, is the weakening of a signal over distance. Okay. The analogy I like to use is if I'm on one end of a football field and you're on the other, and I'm speaking at this same level, if you're standing right by me, it's no problem. Attenuation won't be a problem because we're close enough. You can still get the signals that I'm producing with my mouth. Your ears will pick up those signals. Now, if you're on the other end of a football field, I can increase the signal strength by yelling and even making my voice directional, kind of cupping it in, or increasing the volume of my voice, raising my voice up to a level that you're now going to be able to receive the signal on the other end. It's the same kind of thing that happens in wireless frequency. If you're standing right by me, think about the radio signals as a device that's transmitting is the speaker, and the device that's listening is the hearer. Okay, if the speaker is speaking at a volume that you can understand, even if there's chatter around, if we're close enough, you can totally understand it, right? You can drown out the chatter. My voice, my volume is high enough to drown out everything else. There's no interference, no problem. As soon as we increase the chatter around us, I now have to increase my volume in order for you to be able to hear me, right? And so you kind of notice this dynamic if you've ever been in a crowded room, and there's a lot of people all talking at the same time. You might be sitting right next to someone who normally you could just talk to them no problem, right? But because of the amount of extra interference from other people's conversations, everybody begins to increase their volume. The collective volume begins to go up, and everybody's backing out the extra chatter and increasing their volume for their own conversation. So wireless signals sort of work like that. So anyways, back to absorption. Absorption, if I'm yelling at you across a football field, eventually the sound waves, even though they're not on the electromagnetic spectrum, sound waves are not, the sound waves are going to weaken as they get further and further away from the source, my mouth. So if I don't increase my volume, you're not going to be able to hear it. So that's attenuation. Refraction, this is the bending of a radio signal as it passes through from one medium of a higher density to a medium of a lower density. And this is not only applied to radio signals, this also applies to light. If you've ever looked at, like, I don't know, through a glass, I don't have a glass with any water in it, but water is a different density than air, right? So light is traveling in one direction. Let's just assume for a minute we have water in here. Light is traveling in from one direction and it hits the glass and it kind of bends and warps. And in fact, this also happens with a lens, right? So if you have a lens that you want to increase the size of something with, like a magnifying glass, that would be a different density than the air. And so the light would be bent in such a way as to increase the size in your own vision. So that's known as refraction. That happens with radio signals as well. So when they pass through anything of a higher density, from one density to another, it really doesn't matter if the density is higher or lower. There still could be a refraction if there's a density change. So diffraction or diffraction is the altering of waves as it tries to bend around an object. So when let's suppose this is a solid object that radio waves cannot pass through, like for instance, maybe it's a lead brick, right? Lead is a very high dense metal, or high density metal that radio waves cannot penetrate. And so they would have to bend, they would hit the object and sort of bend instead of passing through it and diffract and refracting. They would diffract by hitting it and kind of bouncing around it, having to go over it. If you've ever seen aerial shots of like an island with like a lighthouse on it, if you've ever seen an aerial shot of that, it's kind of neat because you can sort of see ocean waves brushing up or hitting up against the island, and you sort of see them part and then go around it. And what happens is on the other end of that island, you might have sort of a doldrums of where there's no waves. And so diffraction could affect you in that way. But sometimes, in fact, with radio waves and light waves, they typically bend around and go around an object. But they can be, if bending occurs in radio waves and they need to be sort of specific to allow a signal to be transmitted, that signal could be affected by that bending in a pretty significant way. Reflection occurs when any kind of electromagnetic waves hit a reflective metal. So I talked about the sort of unidirectional antenna being a steel can. Steel would be a reflective metal, particularly if it's polished. Interestingly enough, polished steel does a lot better job than unpolished steel in making a directional antenna because it's actually reflecting a lot better. And so the radio waves bounce around in that steel until eventually, and they actually reflect off the surfaces, rather than some will bleed through, but for the most part they actually reflect off of the surfaces and eventually shoot out in one direction. And so that can occur in a more negative way. That's a benefited way that would occur, but there are other negative ways that would occur. And then finally, scattering. Scattering usually happens at the extremes of the range of a wireless signal. Once absorption has taken place to a significant degree for most of the wireless signals, eventually they've been weakened to the point where even air waves are beginning to scatter them in unpredictable ways. And this would cause a loss in the signal strength. So absorption and scattering both sort of happen at the extremes of wireless signals. Absorption is what causes the scattering to occur. They've weakened down to the point where scattering sort of just happens. And then there's other things that can cause scattering as well. A lot of these other different issues. So refraction can cause signals to scatter, and other instances can cause signals to scatter, really. So, but typically that would happen at the extremes of your wireless signal your wireless frequencies or signals range. Okay, so I kind of gave you a couple of these definitions already. I mentioned throughput and overhead to some degree, but I want to give you some additional definitions. And these don't only apply to wireless. Throughput and overhead and goodput all apply to other things as well, but it does bear mentioning when referencing wireless. So noise to signal, or rather signal to noise ratio. This is the amount of noise compared to the amount of signal. It's a direct ratio. But noise is referring to radio frequency interference. Other Other wireless devices can cause noise. Cordless phones can cause noise on 5 gigahertz frequencies. And when I say cordless phones, I'm not talking about a cell phone. I'm talking about the old school docking station cordless phones. Those functioned at 5 gigahertz typically. And then microwaves are actually pretty notorious for affecting 2.4 gigahertz wireless frequencies because they cook at the same frequency that wireless signals get transmitted, 2.4 gigahertz. So interestingly enough, you could get cooked by your wireless access point. Only kidding there. You can't. It's a slightly different amplitude and slightly different power output that makes it cook things. So it's actually 2.4 gigahertz just happens to be really good at vibrating water molecules, and that's what somebody found at some point. So they happen to be the same as the frequency that's used by a lot of wireless access points. Interestingly enough, a lot of noise comes from or a lot of these very large, and this is kind of an aside, but there's these very large directional antennas that are more like a satellite for the purposes of focusing your signal, or focusing focusing your signal out in a single direction. But they're very large. You don't see them a lot anymore because they're pretty dangerous, but they're large, and then there's an area that it's like, you don't go in this area, it's totally fenced off. If you go in this area, you will be cooked. And actually what happens is a lot of times birds, and not a lot of other animals, can get in because they have the physical barriers, they have the fences up and barbed wire and everything else, but birds will sort of fly in front of the access point or in front of the antenna, and so it's a big dish, like a satellite dish, like what you would use for satellite TV, and they fly in front of them, and before they get to the other end, they drop to the ground because they've been cooked from the inside out. And so you'll find a lot of dead birds sort of on the ground in front of those antennas, interestingly enough. But those are sort of a thing of the past. They're more rare now. They're being replaced by smaller devices that usually transmit at 5 gigahertz. Anyway, so 5 gigahertz is becoming kind of the standard go-to for high speed because it's capable of much higher speeds than 2.4 gigahertz. But anyway, that's just a little aside. Signal to noise ratio, you want to make sure that your signal is a lot higher than your noise. So that's what I mentioned sort of with the analogy of in the room where there's a lot of people talking all at the same time, everybody has to raise their voice. The signal would be raising my voice, increasing the volume, and actually they call it volume in the case of wireless frequency as well. It's measured in the same way as sound volume, decibels, and you increase your volume, increase the power output, increase the signal, however you want to put it, by raising your voice, right, in the analogy. And so you raise your voice to overcome the noise in the room, right? There's a lot of people talking, so I must raise my voice in order to overcome that noise. And so wireless networks do the same thing. So if your signal to noise ratio is anywhere near 1 to 1 or less than 1 to 1, that's not a good thing. That can become a problem. Or so if it's like 1 to 2 signal to noise, that could be a problem. So you want your signal to be higher than your noise. Throughput is the actual amount of data transferred, so this is not counting errors and acknowledgments and everything else. So throughput, when I mentioned how throughput is cut in half by request to send and clear to send packets, that's because those take up a lot of the sort of overhead of sending data. And so overhead is packet headers. So when we talk packet frame headers, that would be overhead. The actual data that's being transmitted would be known as your good put. So your data, so we know that an Ethernet frame, when it's completed, is 1518 bytes at maximum, and 1500 of those are your packet. So when we take the packet header off, that's, what is that? 24 and 24 for source and destination MAC address or IP address on your packet header. So that's 48. So another 48 bits taken off to that. So that would mean that your data portion is going to be a maximum of about 1420. No, 48, 60, 52, 1452 bytes long. So that would be your good put, 1452 bytes per frame, okay? And so how many of those actually get from application to application would be good put. And so that's actually more difficult to measure than anything else. Throughput is what you measure when you go to do like a speed test. If anybody has ever used speedtest.net, I'll show you what that looks like real quick. So if we go to speedtest.net, pull that up real quick. Oops, not SPPA ed test, speedtest.net. Speedtest.net tests your actual, this is testing your throughput. So it's going to do a little ping there, and then it's going to say my download speed is 50 something, 53, 54 megabits per second. So this is measuring not my bandwidth. Bandwidth is what they're advertising, which in the case of Cable One at my house is advertising, if I'm not mistaken, they're advertising 100 megabits per second by 10 down. So you see that we're not quite getting what I'm supposed to be getting down. We're getting not quite what I'm supposed to be getting up, but that's throughput, of course. So when they guarantee something, they're guaranteeing up to this speed, meaning that you won't get any more than that. So they're guaranteeing a bandwidth. So it's not inaccurate what they're saying. So they're saying this is your bandwidth, but your throughput might actually not reflect your bandwidth at all times. So it's a good thing if your throughput and your bandwidth are the same thing. Let's just put it that way. Let's go ahead and continue this on. Oops. All right, and so then I mentioned overhead. This is when you remove everything down just to the data, the 1452 bytes worth of data at maximum, and that's what you would have is after you remove all the overhead, you have good put. Okay, so here are the Wi-Fi standards. I mentioned it's 802.11 followed by a letter to measure different standards. So with Ethernet, it's 802.3, and then there's a bunch of different letters that would follow that to measure different standards of Ethernet. So with 802.11, there's different letters that would follow the 11 to measure different standards. So just a quick look at some of these. A, B, G, N. These are sort of the standards of the past. There's still a few of them floating around here and there. In fact, we've seen a couple of 802.11g network interface cards in my classroom, but these are the sort of little tidbits of information about them. So you see with 802.11a, it operated at 5 gigahertz frequency, but it was fast, 54 megabits per second, but the range was not great, 75 feet. And with 802.11b and G, they both functioned at 2.4 gigahertz, and B, unfortunately, had the slow speed of 11 megabits per second, but the range of 150 feet. So A and B were developed around the same time, and they were used in conjunction with one another. But A is what you would use if you needed high speed, low range. B is what you would use if you needed high range, low speed. Okay, but then G was developed to sort of alleviate the problems and sort of combine the best of both worlds, the 2.4 gigahertz frequency and the 54 megabits per second speed. So you got your range and your speed all in one package. And 802.11g was also backwards compatible with 802.11b. So if I had a 802.11b NIC and an 802.11g access point, they would still work together. And then a couple years ago, I would say probably 2000. I'm not sure when N was originally developed, but I would say early 2000s, maybe 2003 or so. 802.11n was developed. It was very expensive back then, but now it's sort of the go-to standard. N did something really cool. It incorporated 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz into a system known as dual band wireless, and that meant dual. It was talking about bandwidth, but it really means dual band as in dual frequencies, really. So it's 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz. And the maximum data transfer speed for 802.11n was 600 megabits per second. That was if you were using 5 gigahertz bandwidth, or frequency rather. And then 300 megabits per second and 150 megabits per second, depending on what you were willing to pay for, would have been the 2.4 gigahertz frequency. The range on that was 200 feet, though that's questionable. I wouldn't say that you would ever really get 200 feet with any 802.11n networks. And the other thing that they incorporated in 802.11n is multiple data streams, meaning multiple devices could be transmitting and receiving at the same time, because they incorporated that 5 gigahertz frequency, and 5 gigahertz had the ability to do what's known as spread spectrum, meaning the frequency being utilized by different devices would jump around. So on one channel, you'd still be on one channel, but the frequency on that channel had enough play to where you could jump around a little bit and have multiple streams of data at the same time. And then more recently, you have the development of 802.11ac. 802.11ac, though a lot of AC devices have N built in as backwards compatibility, so you might go down to the store and buy an 802.11n AC wireless router, and it would have 2.4 gigahertz. That would be functioning at N speeds, so you'd probably get about 300 to 600 megabits per second out of that bandwidth or frequency. And then the 5 gigahertz frequency would be able to do upwards, depending on the sub variety. There's a lot of sub varieties of AC. Interestingly enough, they went kind of crazy with that. There's really only 3 sub varieties with 802.11n, but 802.11ac had a number of subcategories, and they had different ranges and different speeds. But at the end of the day, the maximum speed for 802.11ac is upwards of 6 gigabits per second, approximately, and then about 200 feet range. And you could have up to 8 data streams now, meaning 8 multiple simulcasts of data that could be going on at the same time. And I did mention already, but this is important for a test question, 802.11b and 802.11g offer 14 channels, but only 11 can be used where we live, North America. And 802.11a up to 24 channels with only 8 used in North America. So you see that written in parentheses here. Okay. Okay, so wireless security. In order to set up a wireless network, you almost definitely want to configure wireless security. There are people driving around specifically with the goal of finding open wireless networks. I wouldn't say this is very common anymore. It was more of an issue back when wireless security was sort of like not really considered a thing. You didn't secure your wireless network. Why? Who's going to need it? So back then you were like, no. There's actually people that drive around to steal your data over wireless networks because you don't secure your network. But now, because the internet has been largely secured using a protocol known as HTTPS, which functions completely separately from any wireless frequency, you're pretty safe. Encryption happens at another level, in other words. So that being said, though, you should secure your wireless network using encryption because, of course, the internet does not use 100% HTTPS. There are still sites out there that use HTTP, which we'll talk about in Chapter 7. But using a couple of different protocols, you have a couple of options to secure your wireless network. WEP, which is Wired Equivalency Protocol, WPA, and WPA2. I recommend WPA2 because it is the most effective at securing a network. WPA and WEP have both been cracked, and cracks are available to anybody who knows how to download a script from the internet and do basic Linux commands. So if you have a little bit of know-how, you can crack a WEP network in a couple of hours and a WPA network in a couple of days. So they're not very secure. WPA2, on the other hand, though recently I read an article that said that WPA actually was cracked, and that on the dark web there was an auction to release a WPA2 crack. But it still takes anybody trying to run it a couple of days to break through. But I would say continue to use WPA2 until something else better comes down the pipes. Maybe WPA3 is on its way, or a brand new encryption protocol for wireless down the line. But the way they encrypt it varies, but I'm not going to go into that. This is not a security course, so I'm not going to delve into it too much. If you want to learn more about encryption, we do have entire classes that are centered around security that would sort of delve into encryption in far more detail. But encrypting data just makes it more difficult to interpret or read as somebody who might be interested in reading your data. So, okay, so the last technology that we're going to talk about, and I know this video is running long. We're almost an hour. This is a long PowerPoint. It's really tough to get through this, so but hopefully everybody's still with me at this point. The last thing we're going to talk about is token ring. The way token ring functions, it's essentially akin to a talking stick. The way I think about it, and I don't know if this analogy flies with everybody, I thought this was kind of the thing that a lot of people could relate to, but I think maybe it's not so much. But a talking stick in the days of summer camp was, if we're all around a fire and we're going to tell scary stories, somebody raises their hand, or maybe if you were in a classroom, you know, in maybe the early 2000s or so, your teachers might have done this and say, no, you don't have the talking stick, so you can't talk. Only Johnny can talk right now. He's the only one who raised his hand and asked for the talking stick. Okay, something to that effect. That would be what token ring is. It uses token passing to make it so that that only one device in a ring topology, whether that's in most cases it would be a physical star logical ring topology. You have an MAU in the center, and this guy would have PCs connected to it. Okay. And data would only be able to travel in one direction. So let's draw sort of the inside of the wires here, or of the device here, and show the way data travels. Okay, so those are our connections. Oops, hopefully this thing focuses eventually. Try to hold it still. Come on. All right, well, it's not focusing, but here, let's try this a little slower. Anyway, we've got our PCs, and data travels around the ring like this, so it only goes in one direction. Okay, so this was the biggest competitor to Ethernet back in the days of the hub, where hubs were the only interconnecting device, and their big claim to fame was no collisions. Collision can't occur if only one device can ever transmit at the same time. So Ethernet developed CSMACD to say, hey, collisions are going to happen on an Ethernet logical bus, but that being said, if they do occur, our devices will retransmit. And so it was like, hey, that's pretty cool, you know. So Ethernet, we know, ultimately won the day, and token ring was beaten out because only one device could transmit at the same time. And with the advent of a switch, there you go, token ring, bye-bye. Okay, so the token is just passed around device to device. They request the token, and the token is released from the previous device when he's done transmitting after a new one requests it. So a device will finish transmitting, he'll hold onto the token until he receives a request for the token. Okay, when somebody requests the token, then he passes it along. Okay, so there is no central control over the token necessarily, it's just passed device to device as needed. Okay, so it operated at 4 megabits per second. This was the big drawback, but when compared to 10 megabits per second, it's like, yeah, who cares? It's not that big of a difference. And it did eventually increase to 16 megabits per second when the competition was really fierce, and eventually to 100 megabits per second. But by then, Ethernet had developed the switch, and it was sort of all bets were off. And so token ring was sent into the garbage heap of history. So it's totally obsolete now. I've never seen it in place one time. I've never once even seen an MAU or seen it function. So it'd be kind of cool to get our hands on an MAU and try and set up a token ring network at some point. But it uses Cat4 unshielded twisted pair, which that's the only time I've ever seen Cat4 written down as a usable type of cabling. But token ring would use Cat4 or higher. So you could use any kind of category 4 or higher unshielded twisted pair. Oh, and then the IEEE standard, Ethernet is 802.3, token ring is 802.5, and Wi-Fi is 802.11. Okay, and then the other type of ring technology that was in use for quite a while and actually died out. We mentioned it. It's FDDI, Fiber Distributed Data Interface. Transmits at 100 megabits per second, up to 500 nodes, which is pretty significant in a ring. It does use token passing as well as token ring, but it uses dual rings for redundancy so that if one of the rings goes down, you still have the other. Basically, it's just two fiber optic strands that are connected together. So, again, FDDI only uses fiber optic cabling. You can't use FDDI over any kind of copper cabling. But it's totally obsolete on new networks. There are still a handful of FDDI devices that I've actually used, but for the most part, I'm changing it out with an Ethernet sub technology called SFP that basically uses the same fiber optic lines and essentially uses 1000 base LX to transmit your signal over the same fiber optic wire cable strands that were in place for FDDI. So, but yeah, you see very little of this anymore. It's becoming less and less. And that's it. I'll show you these questions real quick. You guys can pause and find out the answers to those. So, thanks for watching. Thanks for putting up with the very long show when we're just over an hour. And have a good weekend.